Hello everyone, and this is BioPhoenix here, and today we're taking a look at a game on the Wii, which strangely enough, I've actually never reviewed a Wii game until now. And I think it's mainly because I just really don't like setting up all the controllers for the Wii. It's just such a tedious work. In fact, even for doing this review, I still ran into some issues here and there, so yeah, if you expect me to do more Wii game reviews, they're probably not gonna happen very often. So anyways, with all that bullshit out of the way, the game I decided to pick was Zangeki no Reginleiv. At least that's how I think it's said. Knowing me, it's probably wrong, but then again, are you really gonna get this mixed up with like literally any other game out there? Especially if it's like unique box art where it's all like red and black? Yeah, black Wii case, that's something you don't see too often. In fact, I actually think it makes the game look extra edgy. So, the game was developed by Sandlot, and it was published by Nintendo of all things. In fact, the company Sandlot is the same company that put out games like Earth Defense Force and RAD, Robotic Alchemic Drive, so that alone already makes this pretty interesting start. And it came out in the year 2010, and only in Japan. But the game has received a fan translation that was done by two people, and that happens to be Brand Newman and Gumi. So thanks to them for making this review possible, for that the game is very playable now with actually being able to read what all like the weapons and menus do. But I should also mention that there is a separate patch that does add in subtitles for the cutscenes, but unfortunately I was not able to get it to work. So because of this, unfortunately, I won't go too heavy into the story whenever I do talk about that. But if you did manage to get it to work though, the creators did say that the files are really huge, so it might take up like a shit ton of space. So that is something to keep in mind. And one last thing I have to say and give a huge thank you to is that I have to thank one of my subscribers named Hajime the Fool for recommending this game to me. Because I never heard of it until he brought it up to me, and I thought it looked interesting with the edgy box art, so I was like, you know what, this might be something I could review, and here I am doing it. So let's begin and talk about the game's story, and like I said, I'm not going to go super deep into it because there's really not a whole lot I can say about it, but the game does have a lot of different cutscenes with different characters interacting, so they are trying to tell a story here, unlike with the EDF games, where those games barely had anything like that from the ones I played. So apparently this game has a lot of Norse mythology into it, which I think is pretty interesting. So like the world it takes place is called Midgard, and then they also mention a lot of different gods like Thor and Loki, and even Asgard, and of course the two main characters that you can play as happens to be Freya and Freyr. Yeah, very similar names, but they're both spelled differently. And apparently they transform from eagles to like their human forms, which is also kinda interesting. And then that's where they basically just gotta fight off the enemies that are attacking all the different cities. So that pretty much sums up like the basics of what you need to know. It's all about like these two characters having to fight off against like hordes of enemies that are attacking cities and towns, and you just gotta defend certain people. Alright, so with my lazy story synopsis out of the way, let's talk about the gameplay, which is what I came here for. And the gameplay of this game can be summed up as Norse mythology EDF, because this game basically plays just like that, but instead of guns, you have bows and arrows, you got some staffs that shoot magic spells, and then you also have some like swords and lances and hammers, and many different types of weapons that you can pick from. And instead of killing giant bugs and robots, you are instead killing giant monsters from Norse mythology. So you just have to do all different missions where you just gotta like kill off all these monsters with your weaponry, but also you gotta like defend certain people from dying. And I have to say, they actually do a really good job like keeping themselves alive, because I know in some games where you gotta like escort people, they usually act like fucking dumbasses where they get themselves killed, but in this game, they actually do a pretty good job attacking shit. Like, very rarely I ever had to, like, go out of my way just to help out, like, certain NPCs from dying. And whenever you're not in a mission, you can upgrade both your character's HP, but then you can also upgrade, like, the weapons by going through this giant tree chart, where you unlock more weapons that you can equip to your characters, and of course, you also need some of the materials that the enemies drop. And the difference between these two characters is that, so for the male character, he can only use 2 weapons, but he can use them like unlimitedly, where with the female character, she can use 3 weapons, but she has like a magic meter, so meaning that you can't constantly spam magical attacks, and in order for you to gain MP, you gotta use your melee weapon where that doesn't use any magic. So the female character uses more magical stuff, where the male character mostly uses physical. So there are different strategies that you can utilize these characters with for each mission. And another thing I should mention is that this game actually did have online multiplayer. And apparently the multiplayer missions were pretty different from like the single player ones, so there is some different stuff that you do have going on there, which is really great, but unfortunately I wasn't able to get it to work, so I can't really comment on any of it, but I figured I might as well mention that it's there, and if you do get it to work, then hopefully you do enjoy it. So now, let's get moving on and start talking about the game's controls. And talking about the controls in this game might be a little bit all over the place, but the first thing we gotta talk about is the different options. So you have 2 options. You have the Wii Remote with nunchuck, and the classic controller. And for me personally, whenever I have an option for like the classic controller or the GameCube controller or anything like that, 9 times out of 10, I'm going with the standard controller over the Wiimote, so because of this, I'm only going to be talking about the controls with the classic controller for this one. So as for the button layout, the A button allows you to dash, and you can do it in multiple directions. Y allows you to block, but you can only do it with certain weapons. Start allows you to change weapons, select allows you to pause. The L button allows you to jump, and using the right analog stick allows you to move, obviously, and as for the left analog stick, that is what you'll be using for attacking. So, for attacking with the Wiimote, you just flip the wand around and do different motions to attack. But with the classic controller, you do the same thing, but with the right analog stick, you just flip it in multiple directions, and that's like the way how you cut things. If I can compare it to anything, it's kind of like Metal Gear Rising when you do that slow-mo thing where Raiden just like cuts up multiple things in multiple directions. It's very similar to that. So the button layout is not too complicated and it is pretty easy to get the hang of, but how do they feel? So moving around and blocking is good. The jumping does feel a little bit floaty and weird, but it's not too bad, and besides, you really don't need to jump all that often, so it's not a big deal. But it's worth noting that it is a little bit of a dinky jump. The dodging is also good, but it's also one of those things that you can't spam it like all the time, so sometimes like when you do press the button again like right after, it won't do it right away, so that's another thing to keep in mind. As for the feel of attacking, it's not bad, but it does take some time to get the hang of. Mainly because that the range on some of these melee weapons can be a little bit hard to tell at times, especially with the fact that you have to get right up close and personal to these giant motherfuckers. But the overall flow of attacking is pretty responsive, but I just think like the flow of movement may take some adjustment to get used to. And one thing that I should mention about the melee attacks that I haven't mentioned yet is that you can do a little bit of a combo if you do happen to swing your sword in multiple directions in the right way, and therefore you can perform a little bit of a special move, and of course, you can't spam the hell out of it all the time. Now all of this does sound pretty well and good, maybe there might be some slight little issues here and there, but the one biggest problem I have with the game's controls is that the game's camera control is not very good. So I went over the button layout, and yeah, there's really no like way to control the camera in this game, and because you have to go like right up close to some of these enemies, sometimes it's really hard to tell what you're looking at sometimes with just like these like awkward angles. Now it does do an okay job at adjusting itself, but then there's many times where it like forces you to look a certain way as you're trying to like kill a bunch of people, and it just gets really annoying. So that to me is definitely the biggest problem with this game, is just the lack of camera control. Everything else is good to decent, but the camera control I think is the worst part. Now it's not the worst camera control I ever seen, but it is annoying enough that I think I can see it turning off a couple people. But aside from that, everything else about the controls when it comes to playing with the classic controller, I think is decent. So now, let's get moving on and start talking about the other things, like the graphics. And one thing you have to remember is that yes, this is a game made in 2010, but since it's on the Wii, it is going to look more like a 6th gen game more so than a 7th gen game. Because I'm sure there are going to be some people out there that will say this game looks like complete shit because it's like, oh, this doesn't look anything like anything else that came out in 2010, but, you know, like I said, you gotta keep in mind with the system's limitations, and for a 2010 Wii game, this honestly is not a bad looking game. I mean, for one, I do really like the game's art direction for that. I do like a lot of the character designs. They do have some really cool details that I thought looked really nice. Same thing can be said about the enemy designs, and as for the background graphics, texture-wise, I think it's pretty decent, like it's fine, nothing overly amazing looking, but it doesn't look awful either. But I really had to give them credit for making like these like really huge areas that you can just like explore like so much of it. And yeah, there is a couple backgrounds that do seem like that they do repeat over and over again, but then there are some later on in the game that do look nice. Like, I really like the medieval village that you get to go to, like, later on in the game. I think that place looks the coolest. Plus, the other thing that's cool about this section is that you really get to see what these monsters can really do in a huge city, where you get to see, like, all these different types of destructions. Which I think is a lot more interesting than, like, them, like, just running through a forest breaking down trees. So yes, just like the other EDF games that they've done in the past, the destruction level with this game is also included as well. So overall, I really have to say, this is really not a bad looking game, to be honest. Like I said, I really like the art direction a lot, and I also really do like some of like the set pieces that you get to see later on. So now, as for the game's music, the music in this game is okay. It's not bad, but it's a little bit on the forgettable side for me. So, I will say, I do like the menu theme when you're, like, upgrading your weapons and your characters, where it has, like, that, like, nice little, like, violin piece. I do kind of like that, but as for, like, the music, like, within battles, it's okay, you know, very, like, orchestrated stuff, which I usually tend to like, but for some reason in this game, it's a little bit repetitive, and I do find it to be, yeah, as again, a little forgettable. And given how gory this game is, and yeah, I didn't even talk about that within the graphics, but yes, the gore in this game is pretty awesome, but yeah, but with all the amount of gore that this game has, yeah, you'd think there would be some, like, metal music or hard rockin' tunes or something, but no, unfortunately, there's none of that. In fact, whenever I was, like, getting some footage for this game and I didn't feel like listening to the music, I actually threw on the album Rain in Blood from Slayers, which actually made things pretty fitting whenever I was cutting up a bunch of shit. So yeah, I gotta be honest, the music, it's not bad. I mean, it is kind of fitting for the game, but I wouldn't say it's a favorite. And thinking about it now, their other series, EDF, is also kind of like that for me too with its music. Alright, so now, if you want to go out and buy yourself an original copy of this game, the cheapest I've seen it for was about $24.99, but I've seen a couple of them going for about $30, $40, and a little bit in $50, a little bit all over the place, but I can at least say, at least it doesn't seem to be, like, stupidly expensive. And of course, you're gonna have to do some modifications if you want to add in that English patch. Alrighty, so now, what's my overall thoughts on Zangeki no Reginleiv? So I can say that I do think it is a pretty fun game. I like it. I think it's pretty enjoyable, mindless fun, but it is one of those games that I don't think you should be playing it for like hours and hours on end. Because the game can be pretty repetitive, with not only with the mission structure, but also just with the whole, like, core gameplay itself. It's one of those games where it's a good, like, quick fix sort of game. Like, if you just want something mindless to, like, fuck around with for, like, maybe, like, an hour or so, or if you just need something mindless to stream, like, with a bunch of friends of yours, I can see it being good for that. So if you did want to, like, try and beat this game in one sitting, there's a chance that you're gonna feel burned out, and you probably might end up hating yourself at the end of it, because there's like over 60 missions, and I can't imagine doing that in one sitting. So yeah, it's a game you just gotta take your time to play through, don't just like rush through the whole thing. So now that we got that out of the way, that yes, it is just one of those like mindless fun type of games, well, there is one complaint I do have that I haven't mentioned yet that I do think is very important to mention, is that there is no checkpoints within any of the missions. So if there is a mission that feels like it's taking a little longer and you do die in it, then you have to restart that mission from the very beginning, which can be very frustrating. Now, whenever you die in like a shorter mission, it's not too bad, but it's usually with the longer ones is where it really gets on my bad side. But those are my two biggest complaints with the game, is the lack of checkpoints and the camera control not being that good. But outside of that, I do like the game for what it is. I think it's fun. Also, it does have different enough things going on compared to EDF, so I do think it is a game that could become like a long-running series if they really wanted to, and because it is Nintendo related, I mean, that could also be very interesting. So if you really enjoy games like EDF, then yes, you will more than likely enjoy this one. I wouldn't say it's better than like some of the later entries in the EDF series, but I do think it is better than the earlier ones, and I do think it does still hold up enough. So there you have it. There's a very violent Sandlot game made on the Wii that was published by Nintendo of all people. It's quite an interesting thing to happen that is just so very overlooked. But that said, thanks for watching and commenting, and have yourselves a great day.
Are you eating properly?
I really am eating. This morning I had some soup.
What kind of soup? What's in it?
Bread?
Bread? That's what's in the soup?
And they still fucking taste like shit!